Greetings, everybody. It's wonderful you can be with us today, wherever you are across the United States or around the world. We'll start our State of the American Traveller Technology Edition webinar very shortly. We'll just wait for a minute or so while others are joining and we can see them coming in. So please stand by and we'll be back with you in less than a minute. Greetings, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to our keenly anticipated State of the American Traveller Technology Edition from Miles Partnership and our very good friends at Destination Analysts. My name's Chris Adams. I look after research and insights at Miles, and this is our third annual look in detail at the technologies that are impacting, shaping, and changing travel and tourism marketing. Let me welcome in our very good friend at Destination Analysts, Erin Francis Cummings, who joins us from their San Francisco head office. And Erin, I gather you're not your normal self, running all over the place.
Unfortunately, no. I've been off the road for a few weeks, recovering from ACL surgery. And I know those of you in the audience that have gone through it feel the pain.
So yes, we do feel your pain, Erin. Obviously, this is what highly tuned athletes go through. So Erin is our highly tuned athlete in research. She'll be joining us to cover the latest findings, insights from the State of the American Traveller Technology Edition, the second quarterly edition for 2019. We're also joined by my very good colleagues, C.A. Clark and Andrea Wood, who are going to be our guest speakers today. C.A. joins us from Iowa, Andrea from our head office in Sarasota, Florida. C.A. and Andrea are going to highlight 4 specific technologies and talk through the opportunities that they present. So they've got some great examples and some very practical takeaways on what all this means, looking in particular at 4 technologies, 360, Street View, Maps, virtual reality, and augmented reality. So all of the resources from today are available or will be available after the webinar on our website. You can see the addresses there for both Miles Partnership and Destination Analysts. Everybody who registered for the webinar will receive an email 24 hours after today's webinar with these resources, and that will include a recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck, etc. We want to give our thanks again to DMA West and Southeast Tourism Society, our partners in education. DMA West wanted to highlight a couple of events coming up. End of July there, you can see the Leadership Summit for CMOs, which in the wonderful California destination of San Luis Obispo. And then October, their Education Summit and Vendor Showcase. And then over to STS, Southeast Tourism Society, and I was just at STS Marketing College, so a shout out to everybody I met there. They have what is an increasingly important part of the role of a destination marketing organization and industry today, talking to our congressional partners about the role and relevance of travel and tourism. So their advocacy event on June 11th to 13th. I think everybody's aware of some of the practical issues with regards to joining the webinar today. Please take advantage of sharing questions using the chat box, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end. We'll also be online answering your questions during the webinar. So without further ado, let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. So as usual, Erin's going to cover their research in two parts, taking a regular look at how US leisure travelers are thinking about their travel, and then diving into the detail of the technology edition. And I should highlight that this edition is the first one in which we're combining mobile with technology. Mobile now is such a central and integral part of destination travel and tourism marketing that really we need to talk about mobile in every aspect of travel and tourism marketing, all the editions of State of the American Traveler, but we are going to be taking a particular look at some of the technical aspects of mobile, for example, app usage in this technology edition. And then we'll be joined by CA and Andrea to look at those 4 technologies, and we'll wrap up by just highlighting a few additional resources. So let's pass it over to Erin and have a look at how US travelers are thinking about their travel plans.
All right, just echo Chris's sentiments. Thank you so much for joining us today. As a reminder, the State of the American Traveler Study is an online survey that we've conducted since 2006. We send out a survey invitation to a nationally representative sample of US adults who are then screened for leisure travel behavior. The survey is conducted quarterly. We survey over 2,000 American leisure travelers each time, and we use this research to help travel brands and travel marketers keep their finger on the pulse of American travel sentiment, motivations, and behaviors. We theme each quarterly edition. Of course, today, you know, is the tech and mobile edition, and so I'll be sharing with you data from the survey conducted in April of this year. As always, though, I want to start out with how Americans are feeling about travel, and unfortunately, I have to use this type of photo again, as I did in January. The question that we use to track American travel sentiments, one of 2 or 3 primary questions. In the next 12 months, do you expect to travel more or less for leisure than you did in the most recent 12-month period? In April of this year, 32.7% of American travelers felt optimistic about the number of trips that they were going to take as they looked out over the next 12 months. But putting that in historical context, we see that that's a nearly 5-point drop from a year prior, and quite a significant drop from the peak in the spring of 2017. So as I pointed out in January of this year, I don't think with the way Americans are feeling about travel that we can expect to have the enormous growth that we've been accustomed to over the last few years. However, optimism has seemed to steady out at around this rate. Let's also look at spending expectations, and you'll see a lot of the same story. So 32.3% of Americans felt they were going to spend more on leisure travel in the next 12 months compared to the previous 12 months. And again, if we look in historical context, that number is down notably from, again, a peak in the spring of 2017, where almost 40% of American travelers felt that they were going to spend more on leisure travel as they looked out into the future. And the number of trips, this is already happening in the number of trips being taken. So if we look at the 3-year rolling average of the average number of leisure trips Americans report taking, you see it's around the 4.1 mark. And in spring of this year, we saw the average number of trips being reported by Americans stay as it had in January at 3.8. So again, about half a trip less than they were taking just a little over a year ago. And in looking at travel budgets being reported, we asked this question: how much in total is the maximum you'll spend on leisure travel in the next year? You see it's very similar to what Americans reported in January of this year, stabling out at about just over $3,600 for leisure travel in the next 12 months. All right, so that's how Americans are feeling about travel. I always want to remind everyone, even in tough times, that's often when we have our best ideas. And speaking of best ideas, let's take a look at how Americans are using their mobile phones and other technologies available to them in those mobile phones and through other devices in travel. So first, I'd like to look at the resources that Americans are using for their travel planning and inspiration. And what I'll be showing you here is a map of how much Americans trust these travel planning resources, the frequency that they use them, and the relative importance that they give these resources in selecting the destinations they choose to travel to. So over on the far right quadrant, these are the resources that Americans place the highest importance on. They are most frequently used and also amongst the most trustworthy. So Americans, like many others around the globe, we like our friends and our relatives. And we also just like other human beings' opinions. Reviews websites, as we've seen over the many years tracking this, they are also very frequently used and also seen as very important. However, the trust level is, as you might imagine, not quite as high as friends or relatives. And I'd like to take the opportunity to point out the official DMO, Destination Marketing Organization, assets on this list. Because as you see from the arrows there, while they don't achieve the frequency of use that, of course, friends and relatives have, they are at a similar rate of trust as a reviews websites like TripAdvisor or Yelp. All right, let's look at how one's device that we seem to all be married to play a part in how we get inspired for travel here in America. First, I'd like to point out that 95.7% of American travelers regularly use a mobile phone, and this rate is similar across generations. Even those born before the baby boom, over 90% of them that still travel regularly use a mobile phone. So American travelers have these devices undoubtedly. They're also very often within reach. 4 in 10 American travelers say that smartphone is always within their reach. And there's a behavioral tendency to want to pick up that smartphone to entertain oneself when they're bored. So certainly a device that you'll have a good chance of reaching someone if you're marketing mobily. But let's see how mobile devices play into how American travelers get ideas for travel. So do they use these devices to find inspiration ideas for where to travel to for leisure? 15.8% of American travelers say that yes, they frequently turn to their mobile phone for ideas for where to travel to. And we see that even stronger amongst our younger travelers, our millennials. 3 in 10 of millennials say they frequently reach for their mobile device to get ideas for where to travel to. How do you use your mobile phone to find inspiration and ideas for where to travel to for leisure? Well, similar to how they use the traditional desktop advice, on their mobile phone, the most common behavior is to start searching. So using whatever browser or search engine or search app of choice, 7 in 10 Americans say that they are entering searches on their mobile phone to get ideas for where to travel to. And then underneath that, they're also using those search engines to look specifically for images of photos to get inspired for places to want to travel to. And then they're also very strong frequency on social media websites. And the social media websites that they are turning to for inspiration and ideas for where to travel, we see the strongest or most common use of Facebook, with Instagram very rapidly catching up to Facebook. 60.2% of those American travelers using social media saying that they use Instagram for ideas. And then Pinterest, over 4 in 10 Americans saying they're using, or that use social media for travel inspiration, saying they're using Pinterest for that. In terms of actual travel planning done on a mobile device, let's take a look over time. In the spring, it was 57.8% of American travelers reporting that they did the nitty-gritty of travel planning on their mobile device. You see that's down somewhat from a peak in the fall of 2017. And if we look generationally, though, we see that millennials, though, really strongly continue to use their mobile devices for actual trip planning, and it's just a little, far less so amongst our older travelers who are likely still using traditional devices to plan travel versus doing those tasks on their mobile phone.
Erin, you do the State of the International Traveller, and some of these numbers are even higher in international travel markets in terms of the usage of mobile, particularly Asian markets, notably China. What have you seen in terms of mobile usage for international travellers?
You know, I'm glad that you brought that up, Chris, because I was just going through our State of the International Traveler data, and interestingly, in the Asian markets, they are their mobile behavior is far more ubiquitous than it is in the United States. So we don't see these big generational differences, at least amongst international travelers in those markets. And interestingly, online content that they're accessing on those mobile phones in some of the Asian markets like China and Korea, they consider that content that they're getting on their mobile devices as important as the recommendations that they're getting from friends and relatives.
Good, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's look at digital influencers now. There's a lot of attention in the media being paid to influencers. I'm sure, Chris, you hear this from Miles' clients about how to have an influencer strategy. Is it worth it? So let's look at how Americans are actually using these influencers specifically for travel inspiration and planning. So in the last year, have American travelers used a digital influencer to help plan any leisure travel? And we define a digital influencer for our survey respondents in case they don't know what that is. And so in the spring, we found that yes, 16.8% said they had indeed used the advice of a digital influencer to plan or to pick a place to travel to in the last year, but that's actually down a little bit from what we saw 1 year prior. And this is going to be a theme throughout the remainder of the presentation in terms of the usage of some of these newer technologies. Anyway, millennials, though, as we saw 1 year prior, they are more likely than other or older travelers to have used the opinion of digital influencers. So nearly a third of them agreed that they had used digital influencers in travel decision making. And those who were affected by digital influencers, we asked what opinions those influencers actually impacted, and 45.5% said that the place they chose to visit was because of that influencer. We see that influencers are also very commonly impacting food decisions. Probably not a surprise for those of you on Instagram, but that is as common of a decision they're impacting as destinations or visiting. And a third say hotel and lodging choice was impacted by a digital influencer. And for those who chose a destination specifically because of a digital influencer and looking at the types of destinations they chose, most commonly a large city or urban area, followed by a theme or amusement park, a national park, and then a beach destination or resort. All right, Americans have phones. They are using them for travel inspiration, although, you know, again, not as ubiquitously as some other countries. Let's look at apps specifically now. In the past year, have they used any travel-related apps to help in travel planning? 3 in 10 Americans said that yes, they had used an app. So we've seen this rate be fairly steady over the last few years. Millennials even more likely to have used apps for travel planning. So 4 in 10 millennials said that yes, they had used an app for travel planning. Those American travelers that use apps for travel planning, let's look now at the specific types that they used. OTAs, most common app that American travelers report using, followed by recommendation type of apps, so the TripAdvisor, the Yelp, the Trippies, 44% reporting that. And then airline-specific apps and hotel-specific apps round out that second tier of most commonly used apps. And interestingly, looking at this by generation, pardon me, there really weren't that many differences, which I found fascinating. A boomer is as likely to use an OTA app as a millennial, except in two areas, and one was weather apps. So half of boomers who use apps for travel planning use a weather app, about over twice as many as millennial and Gen X that use weather apps. But our younger travelers are far more likely than our boomers to use local transportation and transit system types of apps. And just looking at app usage over time, so the purple bar on your screen is showing the most recent data, and the light blue bar is going back to 2016. And basically, just take away, for all of these types of apps, we see a similar pattern. There's a little lower usage reported of all these different types of apps than we saw just a few years ago. And looking specifically at official destination app usage, so apps created specifically for a destination or place, a similar pattern, we've seen a decline from 24.7% of American travel app users using a destination app in 2016 down to now 18.5% in 2019. Okay, let's look at use of some of these newer technologies. Let's start with VR. Have they heard of VR? Yes, and this was across generations. 84.4% in total had indeed heard of VR. We saw a big jump from 2016 to 2017 in awareness of VR, and that rate has stayed steady since. Have you used VR to plan travel? Just over 1 in 10 Americans overall have. 1 in 5 millennials say they have. So our older travelers, particularly our boomers, still have not had a chance to use VR. And if we look at this rate of usage over time, because our older travelers are not getting VR into their hands, that rate has stayed stable since 2017. If good content were available, how interested would they be in using VR to research leisure destinations they were interested in? Interest has actually declined somewhat over time in using VR for leisure travel content. Although, in case you're curious, about a third of millennials report being very interested in using VR to research travel if good content was available to them. How valuable do they see VR? 16% give it that top box score. 29% of millennials do, saying that it could be extremely valuable. But again, overall, the rate of people feeling that the content could be valuable has declined slightly. Real-time video. Had they heard of real-time video before we surveyed them? Over half said yes, indeed they had. A slight decline in 2019 compared to 2018. Have they used real-time video to help plan any leisure travel? 12.8% said yes, they did. Again, we see the same decline here compared to 1 year ago. Although millennials, 1 in 5 said that they have indeed used this to plan travel in the last year. So somewhat more usage with that generation. Of course, again, the overall numbers not increasing because it's not getting used by older travelers. Interest in real-time video for travel planning has declined somewhat from a year ago. Although there is definitely some interest there in using that for travel planning. Over 4 in 10 Americans report having interest in using that for travel. And then in terms of how valuable they see this potentially being, 15% say extremely valuable, with another 19.2% saying valuable and 31.9% saying of some value. Overall, those saying that it's extremely valuable or valuable has again declined from what we saw 1 year ago. Following real-time video, looking at 360 video. 1 in 5 Americans overall said that they have used a 360 video in the last year to plan travel. That rate has declined slightly from 1 year ago. And then finally, or not finally, but let's take a look at Google specific content now. So Google curated content, how frequently do they use Google curated destination content to plan leisure trips? 1 in 10 say they always use it. Nearly 1 in 5 say they usually use it, with almost a quarter saying that they sometimes use Google curated content. And use is slightly up from 1 year prior for Google curated content. Interest in Google curated content to research the destinations that they're considering visiting for leisure travel. Over half of American travelers say that they are very interested in using it, and we see that rate stay steady from 1 year prior. How important American travelers feel Google curated destination content is in their leisure destination decisions. 13.3% feel it is extremely important, with another 18.2% rating it as important. And we see that that has increased slightly from 1 year prior. Now let's look at the trust American travelers have in Google curated destination content. 13% feel it's always trustworthy, with a large proportion, 37.7%, feeling that it's usually trustworthy. The greatest share, 40.4%, feeling that it's somewhat trustworthy. And we see trust take a slight decline from 1 year prior. And then to give you some context of what that trust means, we actually had American travelers that took this survey compare what they would trust Google curated versus a GMO, and which they would trust more. And what we found was the greatest proportion of American travelers, 51.4%, are neutral. They trust both the same, but there is a slightly more trust in the local tourism office compared to Google. And that's same as we have seen since we started asking this question back in 2016. And interestingly, looking at this by generation might not be what you expect, but millennials are the same as other Americans, showing a slightly more trust in the official tourism office versus Google curated content. Looking at use of the Google Trips app, 12.1% of Americans said they have used the Google Trip app, which is down slightly from 1 year prior. And the trust that they have about the app, generally feeling it's usually or always trustworthy, and slight uptick in the level of trust in that Google Trip app over the last year. Interest in the Google Trip app, we see a fairly strong degree of interest in the Google Trip app, which has remained steady over time. And then looking at voice-activated assistants, chatbots, AI, etc., have American travelers used these voice-activated intelligent assistants like Siri, Google Now, Alexa, specifically for travel planning on their smartphones in the last year? Well, a quarter of Americans say yes, they indeed have used it for travel. Very similar to what we've seen over the last couple of years. So staying steady, hasn't grown significantly. Almost 4 in 10 millennials, though, say that they have indeed used these voice-activated assistants on their phones specifically for travel planning. Amazon Echo or Google Home for travel planning. 15.7% of American travelers say they have used their Google Home or Amazon Alexa for travel planning, and a quarter of millennials saying they have. And that rate has held steady from 1 year prior. So again, not huge leaps in usage of these newer technologies for travel planning specifically. And then messaging apps and chatbot solutions to book or update leisure travel. 14.7% of American travelers say that yes, they have done that. Slight decline from 1 year prior. And although we haven't seen huge growth in usage of these newer technologies, in terms of agreement that new technologies hold the promise to make travel experiences much more rewarding, we see that 1 in 5 Americans strongly agree with that statement, with another third saying they agree with that statement to some extent, and almost a third of our millennials saying that they strongly agree with the notion that technology does hold that promise to make their travel even better. And finally, I was inspired by my friend Chris Adams on the line with us today. He recalled that Bill Gates said this, that we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. So don't let yourself be lulled into inaction. I put that up here as I don't want you to feel that just because we've seen some steadiness in the use of these newer technologies, that means that you shouldn't be inspired by them in making, or as a travel brand, in using them to get your brand out there, or using them to make your visitor experience better. So in summary, Americans are less optimistic about their travel relative to our previous record years, but sentiment remains steady from January. Newer technologies have been adopted by a proportion of travelers, but have not yet broken through to the next level. That's likely largely due to content available in these media, which CA and Andrea will, of course, cover. And then as a reminder, innovators usually do benefit.
Thanks so much, Erin. And just to provide some context in our discussion there of the Google curated content. So as I think many of you are aware, we've been closely involved in the Google DMO Partnership Program, which is a set of free tools that Google's made available for DMOs. So for the last 3 years, we've wanted to test and validate the importance of that work by asking destination analysts to identify what American travelers are saying about their usage of Google-related content. So as we heard, many of these technologies are flat or in some cases slightly down, but it's likely that we are going to see a number of them at least, and I would put perhaps live streaming in this space moving more into the mainstream over the next sort of 2 to 5 or so years, to recall what Erin highlighted about Bill Gates. Content has been a limiting factor, and Andrea and Sia are going to talk about that, as well as perhaps particularly for virtual reality, accessibility and or cost constraints. So what we challenged CA and Andrea to do is to have a look at 4 technologies in a little bit more detail, and to be able to talk about some practical implications and examples that are relevant to you in your everyday marketing. So I want to pass it over first to CA, who's going to have a look at 360 and Street View, which is, I should say, the Google Street View is part of that Google DMO Partnership Program, but of course there's 360 more broadly. He's also going to look at what's new in Maps. So over to you, CA.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll start by taking a look at Street View here. I just wanted to make sure that we were clarifying kind of what the components of Street View are. So there's really 2 types of content that fall under that bucket of Street View. There is an individual image, so one 360 image, which is sometimes called a photosphere. Those can also be connected into virtual tours and things. Those images can be added directly to maps, but they are often best used when they are added to a map listing. So if you have a business or a park or any kind of map listing, you can add those 360 photospheres directly to that to help consumers understand and travelers understand what that place would look like if they were going to go in there. That kind of Street View falls under Street View content, but those individual images are a little bit different than what we think of, I think, more traditionally as Street View. And that's driving Street View, where we're actually putting a camera on top of a car and driving through some destination and then uploading that content to Maps. So that footage gets added directly to Maps itself and not to individual businesses. and allows the user to move around much more freely in the destination. So those are two different kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about Street View. Most of the rest of the stuff I'm going to reference here has to do with that driving type of Street View, which is more of the traditional but a little bit harder to do type of content. So I think we can all agree that Street View is an important tool for visitors, especially when they're planning and thinking about where they're going to go. You can see this is a really beautiful image from Bermuda. So Street View is an important tool for those visitors to understand kind of where they're going. It's also really important for business owners, and it's important for destinations that they're giving a good impression when people are making those planning decisions. So there's a visual part of this where visitors are making decisions and they're looking at it and they're saying, does this look like a place that we want to go? But there's also an informational layer that is underneath that, where Google is increasingly using this Street View data to do all kinds of things. So whoops, my apologies. Let me just go back one real quickly. Google is increasingly using this stuff to do things like fix directions and find out when roads are closed or when they turn into one-ways. Just in the Bermuda, so if you're familiar with the Bermuda shoot that we did last year, we shot pretty much the entire island with brand new Street View. So just that footage alone generated 100 new businesses that were added to maps that weren't on there before. And those were all added on the back end by Google servers looking at that Street View data and updating it and saying, hey, there's a business here that we didn't know about. We ought to add that. So there's some really compelling kind of back end reasons, aside from the front end reasons of thinking about Street View, for destinations to invest in Street View in various places. And so just some of the examples of things, we obviously talked about driving. That's one of the most basic examples. We put a camera on top of a car, and this is the one that's going to most benefit navigation and things like that. There's all kinds of other interesting things that we can do with that same driving Street View approach, where we put a camera on top of a backpack and we have someone either hiking or walking or biking. So we recently finished a 5-county shoot in Florida that did some pretty extensive beaches and hiking paths and biking and things like that. So some pretty interesting things you can do there. And then we even did boating. So there's a bunch of different waterways in Florida that are being added, and that's a whole other thing to kind of think about in terms of that driving Street View, is putting that camera on top of a car. The two primary things you want to think about as a destination: what are the uses for Street View? Where do I need to be thinking about Street View? The number one, of course, is where there isn't any. So adding Street View where there isn't any Street View at all. This is an image from the Cook Islands, is not one that we did, but Destination put together a package to be able to capture Street View for that destination. So that's really powerful to have a place that wasn't on Street View at all, and then suddenly have all of that. But then it's also important to think about the places where we can update inaccurate information, so old or inaccurate Street View. So this is from Puerto Rico. This is actually a hotel in Puerto Rico, and there's sort of this impression that might be related to the hurricane, and it's not. That was actually a renovation, and it had nothing to do with the hurricane at all. And I'm sure you can find in your destination, when you look around, that there are places where buildings have been renovated, or streets are changed, or things are going on when the car comes through that might benefit from you taking control of that Street View as the destination, and then updating that information. So lots of things to think about in terms of how you might use it in your destination. The equipment gets better and more accessible every year that goes by. We're really only talking about 18 months since users were allowed to upload this kind of footage to begin with, but already we have a second version of the Insta360 camera, which is quite good. NC Tech has put a lot of work into their Street View camera. And then we're even seeing the GoPro Fusion is now down to like $299 on Amazon. And when you combine that with a tool called Trailblazer for Panoscan, you can actually upload, using the GoPro Fusion camera, upload that kind of driving, walking, hiking, biking Street View. So that's becoming quite a lot more accessible. It used to be many thousands of dollars, and is already in a 18 months or 2-year span coming down to just a couple of $100 to be able to do that. Second technology I wanted to talk about was Maps. And so Maps, of course, the ubiquitous tool that everyone uses. I actually read an article the other day that Maps is one of, I think, 5 different tools that Google has that have passed 1 billion users. So that's 1 billion with a B users who are using Google Maps to figure out where to go and what to do. And if you haven't been paying attention to what's going on there, the Explore panel, which comes up at the bottom when you do a search for really wherever you are, you'll have that Explore panel at the bottom. And part of that really is, you know, restaurants and hotels and things that you're sort of used to. But if you keep scrolling in there, there's a whole bunch of destination information that is starting to be surfaced inside these products. And so just very quickly going over what some of those are, you can look at top sites for your destination. That's actually based on visits from people's phones. So it's kind of surfacing those things. These are the places that people typically go in that destination. Events, if ever there was a strong reason to make sure that you are using structured data and the proper schema markup for your events, this is one of them. So it's going to surface all of those different events inside the Maps product. Again, you know, 1 billion users, right? So definitely a good reason to make sure that you have all of your structured data for your events tuned up, because it will not only show up in search, it will also show up here in the Maps app. And then this is an interesting one that we've been paying attention to. We actually helped with a little A/B test in this earlier in the year with one of the Google teams. There's a lists component that is being pulled into Maps here. So these are maps that are lists that anyone can make. You can see that this one was submitted by a local guide here. And you just put together these different places that make sense in your destination. So this feels like a really good opportunity for DMOs to contribute like itinerary content by going into Maps, using their local guides or just a user account in Google and building some lists that can be surfaced in Maps Explore and in other kinds of places. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention one of the other cool things is kind of what people are talking about with the Google Maps app is the AR walking directions. And if you haven't seen that, it overlays these big blue arrows and descriptions and stuff on the roads where you're supposed to turn and where you're supposed to go. That was rolled out originally for local guides. And then just recently, beginning of the month here, it was rolled out for all Pixel owners. And I presume in the next couple of months, you'll see that on all the rest of the phones. So keep an eye out for that. Some pretty interesting things going on with AR. And I think Andrea will touch on some of that next coming up.
All right. Whew. Okay. Thanks, CA. So starting off looking at augmented reality, this is a technology that is just beginning to kind of take hold in its use case for travel marketing. However, with some of the recent rollouts that we've seen with mobile technology, we're also beginning to see kind of a broader adoption and further support of this type of content. So by definition, AR is technology that is superimposing computer-generated images or graphics into an individual's real-world view or their real-world environment. And for most of us, we're first introduced to AR without even knowing it, right? Likely through products like Snapchat or Instagram filters. And while filters and things like photo frames are really fun ways to get visitors engaging with your brands, we see two use cases as being probably the most relevant to you as marketers in a year or two ahead of us. So the first uses the same technology that you just saw CA talk about with Google Maps, which uses image recognition to identify your location and then augment your view with points of interest that appear around you. This example you see here is from Google's I/O conference just a few weeks ago, where they kind of demoed it firsthand for individuals to navigate their event. The second is adding digital objects to create or enhance an experience. So imagine creating an augmented reality arts installation across your city, or trying to bring a historical figure back to life to create kind of that one-of-a-kind experience for visitors. There's a lot of really fun applications for this. But as we look what's kind of on the horizon for augmented reality, what's starting to happen now, what are we seeing? Beyond those exciting new features that we saw in Google Maps, we're seeing these tools being enabled in other established products within Google, like Search, for instance. In this example, you can see that the great white shark is being showcased in the Google Knowledge panel. And so individuals who are searching for this criteria They're seeing this information pop up. They're able to actually manipulate and engage with a 3D object, which is essentially the core assets that are being utilized with AR. So it's another use and application for these assets once you've invested in them. But it really doesn't stop there. Within Google Lens, users are going to be able to scan and search restaurant menus, which is going to unearth really valuable insights without even having to go out to search and key in what you're looking for. So I think this really underscores the importance of ensuring that we have that really rich, relevant content in our Google My Business listings so that we're serving up the right content for users. So even Facebook has invested in their own augmented reality engine. This will allow developers to create augmented reality content for both Facebook and Instagram. It's a really easy to use system that will enable us as marketers to create much more cost-effective content in this space. And as we begin to see augmented reality existing in our everyday lives on platforms that we're using most often, eventually consumers are going to start to expect more from us in the way of immersive marketing from DMOs. Okay, so the second one is virtual reality. And in its truest form, virtual reality is an experience in which you are engaging in a computer-generated environment, and you're utilizing a virtual reality headset, and you're also engaging with things like sensors and handheld devices to really immerse yourself in that experience. However, most of us are getting our first taste of VR with 360 videos, and these are 360 videos perhaps that are being played through a headset. And while it doesn't technically check all of those boxes on the true definition of virtual reality, it certainly is an immersive experience, and it allows us to give a visitor that accurate portrayal of a destination. So how does this translate for what we should be doing as destination marketers? I think the 360 content that we're seeing developed is going to be really applicable. Things that you might consider covering as you're developing 360 video or 360 photospheres is content that showcases an overview of your destination, or really driving down into creating galleries of special interest content that people can really kind of pop around across within your portfolio there. Also, as we look to the future for virtual reality for our industry, I don't anticipate that we're going to see major investments in that computer-generated style content, but this 360 video and photospheres that can be accessed and engaged on the devices that we already have and use on a day in and day out basis, like our mobile phones or our desktop devices, I think are going to be the sweet spot. So with that being said, I know we have some folks that are early adopters who've already put a lot of work and effort into developing this type of content. So I want to give you a couple of ideas on where you can kind of take this as a next step. And so in this first example, you're seeing this is a San Francisco neighborhood tour that they've taken some individual 360 images and kind of strung them together with the use of interactive hotspots and embedded content to really activate this content in a unique way. You might also consider activating this type of content through fun portal AR experiences, like this one from Scotland, which allows the user to view 360 content, but in kind of these immersive environments. And then the last one, and likely the simplest concept for broadening distribution on your investment, is activating it in your digital media with these immersive display ad units. So these are 360 display units that you can integrate into your current efforts. And I highly recommend that if you've already invested in developing this content, that you leverage it here, because these ad units are actually serving up at least 3 times the engagement of traditional display. All right, so quickly, 3 takeaways before we can get to our Q&A here. The first, I think, making the leap from being aware of new technologies to experiencing them really means that as an industry, we need to commit to creating content to fuel that pipeline. The second is, as you're considering these opportunities, focus on the technologies that are widely accessible and also transferable. And that means that these are assets and content that you're investing in that you can push through your owned, earned, as well as your paid channels. And then as with any of your marketing efforts, make sure that you allow for and have some budget to test and refine and optimize your strategies moving forward. All right. Hand it back over to CA to get us started on some, Chris, just get us started on the Q&A.
Thank you. Some important insights there. So let's just have a quick look at a couple of questions before we wrap up today. So just to remind everybody, the slide deck is going to be available along with a recording of the webinar, and we'll be sharing that link in an email 24 hours afterwards. We've got a number of questions from Tad, Becky, Brian, and Carrie. I'll just come to those in a moment, but if we just look at a couple of resources that we also wanted to highlight today. So that's a reminder about the web addresses where you can get copies of the slides and other resources in addition to that follow-up email. And then in terms of additional areas and opportunities, we are looking at the Traveller Segments edition at the end of August. So that is a deep dive into different traveller segments. We've looked at by age, by interests, and so we take a slightly different tack each year based on what the data tells us are the emerging or most important traveller segments. And then at the end of the year, we're actually going to have a special edition. So shortly, we're going to be going out to all of you and indeed our wider community to ask for ideas on topics and subjects that we should consider including in this special edition of the State of the American Traveller. Okay, so and the resources, we've got a wide range of resources. This particular blog that we've got highlighted there answers that question that came up, and there was some good data in terms of usage of destination apps. That's a question we're commonly asked, and we in fact answered that question with quite a detailed summary. Do I need a mobile app? And in short, for most destinations, the answer is probably no, but we talked about some of the use cases that might make sense. And you can see some of the other topics and content that we also cover. In other resource areas, we've talked about some of the Google programs. Erin covered the usage of those. There is a free program that you can sign up to get access to free tools, which include Street View, so you can capture and upload your own Street View for free. The only cost there is purchasing a Street View camera, but we do have a support program if you need help. We have loan cameras, in Street View loan cameras, and a variety of other support programs, including industry education, etc. So let's get back to those questions. So Tad was asking, with the usage of so many tech devices, how is this impacting print? And we've seen print usage hold up consistently between sort of 45, 50% or so over the last decade. Certainly the use of print is evolving and changing, and it's arguably moving more to the inspiration stage, and we're certainly seeing less detailed planning use of print, for example, for accommodation selection or for maps or direction information, for example. But print can still be a very valuable part of your overall media mix. And we've got a couple of white papers, Hyper-Informed Traveller and the value of print, that's available on our website that goes into that in more detail. So Carrie asked, and this is a question for you, CA. She was looking at that Street View content that you showed, and it was branded with the DMO. So I talked about how people can create and upload their own Street View. Do you want to provide a little bit more background on that and how you can brand it?
Sure, that's one of the interesting additions to what's called the user-generated Street View program that started about 18 months ago, was announced, I guess, almost 2 years ago. So the way that the Google teams who are in charge of this describe it is that it's like adopt a highway. So if you pay to have the Street View shot in your destination, then you get attribution in the form of a logo in what's called the nadir at the bottom, or the zenith, which is the top of each of those photospheres. So like in the case of Bermuda, that was one of the benefits that we got out of that. Obviously, there's the updated Street View, which is good for visitors and businesses and all of the things that we've already talked about. But there's also the ability to count the views on those images. There's about 366,000 images that we uploaded. All of them have that Bermuda branding at the bottom of them. So, you can't put an ad in there like dancing baloney or 20% off or stuff like that, but you can put your logo because you paid to have it done. And everything that you upload, you'll be able to track views for. So like, depending on the size of the destination, you can be looking at several million views in a year, or sometimes even in a month, depending on how much of it you've shot. And you'll actually be able to see how many people are viewing those images.
Very good. So yeah, great opportunity there. And let's just take one final question. Susan Mies has asked us, very topical question, how do we see this technology translating from marketing into sort of managing visitors? So for example, on the ground management of visitors, including technologies that allow them to be encouraged to visit different locations. She talks about touch screens, for example. So this whole issue of managing visitors, particularly around hotspots or areas where there's over congestion, is certainly something that's topical. CA or Andrea, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, just from the standpoint of what's going on in our industry and the overall dialogue. I think more and more DMOs are recognizing the need to also be engaged in the in-market experience. Oftentimes that's, related to, wanting to ensure that, if you have an attraction that has unique or limited operating hours, that you're helping to provide information that allows them to, you're either augmenting that limitation so that they are not coming out of your destination with negative perceptions. So there's technologies that you can use to help engage users, not only in the planning and marketing stage or process, but also when they're in your destination. Having the ability to engage people through an app is one way, but you really need to make sure that if you're going to go that route, that you're creating really unique, engaging experiences or opportunities, and you're creating a value proposition for them that they can't get through Google or somewhere else. If you have visitor centers, absolutely investing in the latest technology so that you are encouraging them to engage with the content that you have, I think is really a no-brainer.
Okay, so we're approaching the top of the hour, so we'll answer some additional questions online, and just a reminder, everybody's going to receive an email with the slide set, a recording of the webinar, and also the research report. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Aaron Francis Cummings from Destination Analysts and the whole team there that makes this research possible, and also to Andrea and CA for putting together their insights and takeaways on those 4 technology areas. And most importantly, thank you to you. We look forward to connecting with you at the upcoming conferences over the summer in the United States or elsewhere. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.